Welcome, everybody, or welcome back to the second module of CTM's Research Networking Day. My name is Bethanien. I am the interim professor for the theory and history of popular music studies at Humboldt University, and I'll be moderating our module, which is named The Sound of Change, Listening to Instability. I hope you're all feeling stimulated by the talks during the first module. And I hope you're feeling fortified by your lunch meals. How are the energy levels going? Can you give me a little signal? Are you falling asleep? Or are you, medium? Okay, good. Well, I hope we can stimulate you intellectually. I'm immensely grateful to all the curators, co-curators and organizers, especially Anita, Dalia and Thaisa. And I'm also really excited to work again with this team of amazing women who run the production here, especially Amelie, and then also the women who run its sound technology, like Elle, for example, who's doing all this magic in the back. We're also here with a group of students from Humboldt University, and we spent our time since October, amongst other things, reading Victor Turner's work on liminality, mapping it onto what we were expecting from CTM 2020 as we kept watching how the festival program was revealed. We were reading Erika Fischer-Lichte's work on aesthetic experiences, liminal experience, to build a theoretical toolkit for our own ethnographic research of performances. And we were applying also Judith Butler's theory of performing gender on performances of last year's CTM act, Linda Quebrada, in order to practice for this year. So, and we were also reading Stefanie Menrad's work that Yasmin Khaleli quoted today. So that in a way, in many ways, actually, the Research Networking Day here today is the beginning of the payoff of the theoretical and methodological work we've been doing during the winter term. So I'm really elated to be able to moderate this panel, this module, because it's a really illustrious group, and all the participants, I don't know if you had a time to look at the biographies, all have an artistic practice as well as being academics. So I look forward to three particularly rich contributions. Anyone who's come here to see Elsa Gillies speak, unfortunately she cannot be here today, but do check her out when you see her somewhere else. So we're three presenters today here. Giada Dalla Bontà, Alex Yiu and Matilda Jones. We'll be here until 4:30, then there will be a coffee break, and then we'll continue with the third module. And the first speaker in our module today is Alex Yiu. He's a sound artist, producer, curator, and a researcher who's based in Hong Kong. And he also has an artistic alter ego, a collective called Absurd Tracks. He'll be performing at Berghain on the 29th at Säule, so do go and check him out. And the floor is yours, Alex.
Is the microphone working? Thanks. Thanks for coming. And so first of all, I would like to thanks Goethe Institute Hong Kong for sponsoring my air flight. And so like you guys might actually heard about what's going on in Hong Kong last year. And this time I'd like to talk a little bit more in depth, particularly in relation to the sound and music in the Hong Kong 2019 protest. So before I talk in depth with my case studies, so I would like to talk about a little bit of the background of the 2019 Hong Kong protests, just in case if you don't know what's happening. So in February 2018, Pun Hiu-wing, the girl, a 20-year-old lady from Hong Kong, was murdered in Taipei by his boyfriend Chen Tongkai, also from Hong Kong. The Hong Kong government has failed to neither charge the man with homicide nor send him back to Taiwan for trials, since there's no extradition treaties in between Hong Kong and Taiwan. Then the Hong Kong government has proposed an amendment bill to establish a mechanism for the transfer of the fugitives on the order of the chief executive. However, the amendment does not only extend the extradition area to Taiwan, but also mainland China, where the disbelief of Chinese juridical system from Hong Kong has persisted since Causeway Bay book staff's disappearance and all other human rights abuse from the jails of Ai Weiwei, death of Li Wangyang, and Nobel Prize receiver Liu Xiaobo. The bill has eventually triggered waves of protests and unrest since June of 2019. Since the 12th of June, the Hong Kong police has begun to tackle the protests at riot control, where tear gas, rubber bullets, pepper spray, water cannons has become major tactics of dealing with protesters on the street. Clashes and violence have since escalated and eventually led to a series of violent events took places on the street, metro stations, shopping malls, residential areas, and even university campuses. Ultimately, it led to the landslide victory of the pro-Democrats in the 2019 District Council election. Although district councils in Hong Kong only consist of symbolic status and has limited rights in governing, it at least represents the majority of the Hong Kong people as standing with the protesters. While we see the initial idea of the protests were about asking for the withdrawal of the extradition bill, requests such as calling for an independent investigation of the police abuse of power, discharging the arrestees, retracting the proclamation of riots on 9th and 12th June, and calling for an immediate dual election through universal suffrage have become the major calls from the protesters. These calling, particularly the last one, calling for immediate dual election through universal suffrage, can trace its roots from the 2014 umbrella movement, where protesters were occupying parts of the city centers, calling for a truly representative form of elections for both chief executive and the legislative council. In against of the political reforms led by the Chinese government, who reserves its right to select their favorable nominees in the chief executive election, which is considered by the protesters as fake democracy. So in this presentation, I focus only two significant forms of protest in relation to sound and music. And I argue that these sounds and music contribute to the formation of Hong Kong nationalism, where its ritualistic quality and inventiveness have created a sense of nation. The first is call for shouting protest slogans at 10 p.m. every day at their home, in Cantonese 10點高叫. Originally, it was also a call for action in the online forum, LIHKG, Lindeng. The action itself brought protest slogans into residential areas. Due to the high-density nature, the proximity in between buildings is close enough, and in many cases, one public or private estate consists of several high-rise buildings, creates a form of echo chamber, where buildings act as the wall of reflection for the sounds to circulate. Well, there's no sound coming. Just a minute. So here I would like to play you an example from the sound that I record from my home. Technical issue. There should be sound. Oops, wait. Hi. See, so I've had a file here, so I would like to play the sound. There's no sound. So let's hear from the beginning. Cool. So this clip from the recording is recorded on the 2nd of September at my place. So it happens during a period of time in Hong Kong where there's protests and people shouting the slogan from their own place in Hong Kong. So after that, oops. So I would like to focus on talking about the things that they said in the slogans. So what you hear is probably you can see here, things that of the people, the concern of the people. But many protest slogans are in couplet form, which allows slogans to be shouted in a call and response format. And many of the slogans does not only directly call for the government to fulfill the demands, but many slogans are actually denunciations of the police brutality, and in reaction to several days of clashes to remind people what the police has done. Some of the slogans, such as Hong Konger add oil, changes its word in response to certain events. So you can see Hong Konger add oil happens to be from June to August, but actually even further into October. But after the enactment of the anti-mask law in early October, people start shouting Hong Konger receipts. And eventually, after the first death of the protester in November, the people on the street start shouting Hong Konger revenge. We see how protest slogan changes through the time and with the events being in development. And there's one very important protest slogan, which is the first one, 光復香港時代革命, Liberate Hong Kong, Revolutions of Our Time. This particular slogan originally was an election slogan used by the political party leader Edwin Leung of Hong Kong Indigenous. In 2016, in the New Territories East by-election, this slogan was used by Edwin Leung, who is also a University of Hong Kong graduate, to use the slogan as an advocacy of self-determination and even independence. In 2018, Edwin Leung was sentenced to 6 years of imprisonment by the High Court because of his incitation and participation in the 2016 Mong Kok civil unrest. As the most recognizable slogan in the 2019 Hong Kong protests, this slogan is not only being heard from protesters shouting, but it also appears in the lyrics of Glory to Hong Kong, which is the second example that I'm going to talk about. So Glory to Hong Kong, you may see in the video, people get together and then they sing it together in shopping malls, in protests, and in numerous occasions. So first, maybe I can show you what actually does it sound like. So the lyrics of Glory to Hong Kong in Cantonese is characterized by the use of rhetorical questions to express the sadness, angst, and fear coming from the people. A vocal and pictorial description of the people section in against of the unnamed antagonist, and a notion of togetherness from the call of the trumpet, where the down is for the liberation of Hong Kong and the revolution of our times, to wish the longevity of democracy and freedom, and finally, let the glory be to thee, Hong Kong. In comparison to previous Hong Kong protest songs or other songs in relation to local identity, such as Under the Lion Hill, Xiji Sanha, where its lyric describes the struggles and commitment of refugees' ideal to build a better society with a mixture of orchestral and pop music elements. Glory to Hong Kong references what Christopher Keelan describes as an anthem style, with its lyrics refers to the local slogan, dramatization of the fears and struggles, and the glorification of ideological values such as freedom and democracy. This song is an invented tradition, which many Hong Kong people perceive this as the unofficial national anthem of Hong Kong, by singing it on top of the Chinese national anthem during football race and school assembly. The song is also a target of mimicry by the police supporters, where lyrics has been changed in order to support and justify the police action during the protest. For Benedict Anderson, the sense of we is an essential element of forming national identity. In this case, the we in Glory to Hong Kong has further fostered an imagined community under the myth of what's to be claimed or unclaimed. The never meant to be unfinished process of the decolonization of Hong Kong. It's a matter of time whether China still relies on Hong Kong as the state of capitalism to serve Chinese interests or not. In a pragmatical sense, it would be disastrous to think if Hong Kong is merging with China by force, although it's not actually unthinkable. A.D. Smith quote Eric Hobsbawm, "Nationalism is a substitute for lost dreams, a reaction to the disappointment of large hopes and aspiration." The meaning of the protest slogan and the lyrics of Glory to Hong Kong could be considered as the invented tradition of Hong Kong nationalism. As to quote Hobsbawm and Ranger, invented tradition is taken to mean a set of practices, normally governed by overly or tactically accepted rules and of a ritual or symbolic nature, which seek to inculcate certain values and norms of behavior by repetition, which automatically implies continuity with the past. In fact, where possible, they normally attempt to establish continuity with a suitable historical past. If we consider the Hong Kong nationalism is a mixture of civic and ethno-linguistic nationalism, Edward Leung, the leader of the political party Hong Kong Indigenous, would be an example of how civic and ethno-linguistic nationalism merge in the Hong Kong situation. While Edward Leung was born in Wuhan by his parents from mainland China, he was growing up in Hong Kong, recognizing the differences and values in between Hong Kong and China, and his ideal where oneself can choose to become a Hong Konger by following certain values and practice. Ultimately, it's also what Hong Kong people is going through in the Hong Kong protests of 2019 till now. Perhaps there's no turning back, yet may I quote Edward's letter to Hong Kongers which he wrote in jails. "The people who should be resolving societal issues are choosing to turn the cold shoulder. Instead, they seek keen to put Hong Kong's destiny on the line in a game of political gamble. What we need now is not to gamble our precious lives against them, but to purify and transcend our perseverance and hopes through our suffering." So at the end of the presentation, Hong Kong, we probably see on the newspaper, understanding is going through such a difficult period. And from a perspective in response to the CTM festival Liminal, the idea is that we see Hong Kong has went through colonization, and after the handover, the actual post-colonial or the process of decolonization has never really enacted through under the Chinese government rules. And frankly, in the protest, we see a lot of time the abuse of power through the government, and also the laws that in favor to prosecute the Hong Kong protester has its historical roots in the colonial time, whether like the rules of riot and also the laws talking about incitations of people's riots in the situation. So, and I think like, Hong Kong is in the process of becoming a Hong Kong, as my title suggests, but what exactly Hong Kong means, and I will probably like leave you guys to think about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alex, for your presentation here. I've learned so much. It's been really, it's been a lot of information. So while I'm babbling on, I hope that you are collecting your thoughts and formulating questions in your minds. Are there any questions already at this point? Please raise your hand. There is one question in the back.
In terms of music production, like making music, has there been an influence, like in recent, like the past year or so, of like making more aggressive music, or music being used as a tool to just how does that manifest in the musical output of people who make music and are there or from there?
Well, for the case of music, and I would say for the last few months, there's been a lot of music, whether directly or indirectly, particularly in pop music, to talk about the struggle and also persistence. I think the topics of persistence is very prominent in recent, pop music, in Hong Kong, particularly in Cantonese. But also there was like one song by a local pop singer, Charmaine Fong, which is actually quite a rare, tracks. So in Hong Kong pop music, Canton pop music, there's you don't always see the techno beat in our music because it's not that common. But that new song by Charmaine Fong is kind of like a techno beat, with the music video being referencing some of the violent scenery in the protest, and where she was the few local singer where she was using vulgar words in the lyrics where to express the discontent of feelings and also yes, so there's an example for there's I would say almost like an effective terms for Canton pop music, but I think for a lot of artworks, what we might see is there's things we call it art strategy instead of artwork in the Hong Kong protest, where people using different kind of strategy in art to do advocacy to support the Hong Kong protest. But I would say we probably still have to wait and see the real influence on the contemporary art in Hong Kong after this protest, because I feel a lot of time the artworks that the works being produced during or in response to the protest is reactionary. So maybe we can see how the next coming few years to see how these artists have an in-depth insight for the production of art in Hong Kong after the protest. But there's already been a lot of Hong Kong art actually has already working with dealing with issues of post-colonialism and also about the ideas of Hong Kong identity. But this is not part of my presentation here, but we can talk about it later.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, there's a question here.
I was very impressed by the video you showed from the orchestra and the choir. I'm do you have any more information how this video was produced? Because I think that is in itself the act of recording this and organizing something like this could be in some way connected with harm, or could be in some way unsafe for those people doing this. Do you know anything else about this organization of this video?
Well, just for the case of protecting the information, I would not mention any names here because they would like to remain anonymous. But yes, I do know the people who's behind the video, and I'm also know about the people who are making the song Glory to Hong Kong. And as I know, the production or the time spent on making the video was only just like a week or two, something like that. And then those musicians that you've seen playing in the video, they are more like, they're like semi-professional and amateur, because like they're all like, so there's like, orchestral music culture in Hong Kong, where like people, they used to learn how to play the instrument, and then they graduate, and then they are not becoming a professional musician, but they still try to play, and play music. So there's a lot of like these kind of like, semi-professional and amateur symphonic or like philharmonic orchestra in Hong Kong. And the people who's behind the group is they are all semi-professional, which is like they might have a full-time job, but they still play the music. And then they might be like, a full-time music teachers, but they also play in the video. And they, as I know, like the production of the video and the sound recording are all voluntary. It was recorded in I think it was in early September, which is like the time when the Glory to Hong Kong only being published for like, for weeks or two, because like, so there's more backgrounds of the Glory to Hong Kong. So first, the song was actually being put out also in an online forum, Lindang, LIHKG, and then the lyrics are being discussed, and then the lyrics are being authored by a collective, a force by the user on the forum. So this is actually the final versions that came up with, like, collective, selection. And as I know, the slogan, Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our times, this slogan is actually being put into the lyrics after the collective effort. So which is interesting, because like, these songs, for me, has fundamentally different from what we perceive as protest songs. Because we see protest songs exist in numerous formats, including, it might be just a pop song, nursery rhyme, or even like a spoken poetry. But this song is a very classic example of anthem, like an anthem, which is actually a kind of anthem that using like orchestral instrument, and then like in terms of the musical structure is a AABA form, and it's a kind of short, songs, and it's not supposed to be. It's not like it's not a usual like a protest songs that we will perceive. Let's say from the '60s in the North America during that time, and this one has a very sense of like nationalism for me, as I would understand, and I also feel like a lot of people who are involved making this video and the music has a very vague sense, and they would like to ask for more autonomous status for Hong Kong. But does it necessarily mean independence? I would rather say like that area is very ambiguous, and I would not try to expose anyone. Just kidding. Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, this is all incredibly interesting information, and I can see one more hand up here in the front.
Hi. I've been working a lot in Hong Kong recently about the protests, and one group that I spoke to recently were a bunch of church gatherings in public areas. And it was really interesting because they were commenting to me about how they loved meeting in shopping centers and stuff because of the acoustics. And it really gave them a new ways of exploring just the very choirs. And when you mentioned the appeals at 10 p.m. And using the tall buildings and the acoustics, I was wondering if there's maybe like a greater appreciation now in Hong Kong about acoustics and field recordings and stuff like that.
Well, I think like, well, that goes into the practice of field recording, but like, well, I mean, as a sound artist, like, I would say like it's difficult to do field recording in Hong Kong because like, it's a city where like, it's almost impossible to actually get the characters of the sound where like, the background noise is very strong. But I would say like, there's a levels of, well, political qualities, in particularly with, this 10 p.m. shouting in Hong Kong. And it has to do with like, the high density levels of like how people live in Hong Kong, where like imagine like if the same thing took place in America, it's not gonna work because people live like, so far away. But in a sense like this is very Hong Kong, I would say, stylistically, and then, the way, and then also like I could go into like the law. Like in Hong Kong, the noise law in Hong Kong, where it only goes from after 11 to the morning in the 7 a.m. So when they were, doing this at 10 p.m., legally speaking, it's not against the law somehow. So like there's a trick there. Like if they're gonna do this in 11 p.m., there's gonna be a problem.
Thank you, Alex. If there are any more questions, I would like you to keep them and maybe refine them until the round table at 6 o'clock because we need to move on for the sake of time. Thank you, Alex Yiu, for your presentation, and we see you again later.
Sorry.
Yeah, and thank you for linking the topic of the recent protests, the ongoing protests in Hong Kong, to our module topic, the sound of change, listening to instability. Our next speaker here is Giada Dalla Bontà. She is from Italy, but she is an independent scholar who works and researches in Berlin. Again, she's an artist as well as a researcher. She's also a curator and a writer with a focus on unofficial Soviet art and music. One of her artistic endeavors is working on a fanzine that came out through the Stahlplatt label, so everyone who's interested in experimental music, go and check that out. She's received several grants and scholarships and worked with several high-profile art institutions such as the Venice Biennale or the Mondrian Foundation, and she's working on the incredibly exciting subject of the post-socialist phase in 1990s Russia. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, very much for you being here. I have a stupid question, how to make this full. Thanks. I guess it's very easy. Thanks. So, yeah, thank you very much again for your introduction. As you have rightly said, I am mainly specialized in Soviet and post-Soviet culture, and I'm recently focusing more in the non-official or underground music. What I'm going to talk about very quickly and a bit probably superficially is exactly the moment of the dissolution. So it will be what I'm going to show is what is going on before the dissolution of the USSR and what survived and is still going on nowadays from those moments. First of all, I have to say that for sure there are very, very common examples of these non-official music, which range from pop, from balladeers, so mainly poets singing, and rock, which are a huge phenomenon that afterwards in the 90s became basically mainstream. But what I want to focus on is something much more specific, and I will explain later why I have chosen these three specific topics. So here down, I have just shown a very, very concise history of what happened during the Soviet period concerning music, just for those of you who maybe do not know about it. I'm not going through that, but if you want just to refresh your memory, you have it there. For sure, what I might say is that for many theoretics about Soviet and post-Soviet culture, liminality is a very, very familiar term, in the terms that the idea of Soviet citizens was very often positioned by critics in a liminal zone, in a gray area, of a binary life. So on one hand, we have a public official behavioral code to follow almost automatically, and on the other hand, a private life which is much more free depending on who the people that are living with you are. This state of, let's say, liminality has been exacerbated in the late 80s when the position was already ambiguous. So from the mid-80s, there was already an ambiguous space, which in a past that has been already obliterated, but is still automatically being repeated somehow, even though in very different forms compared to the 50s or the 30s, and a future which has yet to come. And here you can see like two quotes from some of the most important few of the most important theoreticians of the postmodernism and post-Soviet Russia, which are talking exactly about this nature coming from this binary opposition, which is defined as paralogism. So the tendency to create unstable and frequently conflicting and even explosive hybrids that are repeating throughout the time in different contexts, with different content, but with the same form, in that of a dichotomy. And the reason has been explained already in the 90s by Mikhail Epstein, who was exactly pointing at the rhythm of cultures like the Russian one, which is exploding rather than having a progressive kind of gradual process and path, as most of the other culture are usually theorized to be. And what is happening in this case is that there is a ritualized caesura, which is lacking. And this is creating a kind of like ontologization of the concept of void in this cultures who were at the beginning with the revolution and then with the fall of USSR created some kind of like residual signifiers and hybrids, which are repeating as patterns throughout time, mixing in a way with new elements, but never being elaborated in an organic way. So there is a sense of this, there are these symbols and these signifiers which are suspension, and they are seen as they are recurring with different figures like those of ghosts or those of angels also from the 90s on in the Russian culture. And this reminds me a lot of what has been thought by Agamben when he's talking about the concept of history and experience mainly, with Infancy and Infancy and History book, where he's basically outlining how, and this is really relevant also in the concept of historical liminal moments, that the development of culture relies on the interdependency of two dynamics. So on one hand, we have the play, and on the other hand, we have rites in terms of rituals. And the development is based on this interdependence, where on one hand we have structures which are fixated with through history and existent with rites, and play, which instead is transforming these structures into events. So he's playing and deconstructing them again. And he's using mainly the example of the ritual of funerals, which is, of course, is also reliable with the sense of disgregation, which was imminent in the late 80s and also or in the 90s, with the idea of ghosts or larva, as in Latin, which is a sign of instability that is appearing once a person is dead, or once an institution or a system, or cultural system is dead, and which is fixated by the ritual of funeral, so that this sign of instability stops to haunt, as to say, the current culture and the living people. So this is more or less the perspective that I took in choosing some of the artists that started their activities maybe even in the late 80s, but who are still active, and which are way less known than rock or music or balladeers, for instance, and who are in a certain sense showing the polarity of these dynamics that I described. So on one hand we have a certain an attempt to recreate a kind of rituality, on the other hand a play, and the third, as we will see, would be a kind of syncresis, an attempt to cope with this moment of liminalities. So besides the history that of course I don't want to go through for you, but one of the important things to remind is that since 32 there was an official poetic, which was that of social realism, and in that very same year a union of Soviet composers was established, and any musician who wanted to be recognized as such had to be part of it, and any new work had to be submitted to them before being published. This during the 80s already changed somehow, but the structure is still there. Knowing this, I want to remark that there have been, when we think about unofficial and experimental Soviet and post-Soviet music, there has been basically no real oppression, physical repression. So none went to gulags, as many have heard the thing happened, but they were basically cut off from the fundamental phenomenon of accessibility for the institutional set that I described before. So one of the most important features of unofficial music was, first of all, the DIY culture. We are talking about people who had to have a job and to go on producing and performing or consuming outside of their working time, which usually was very intense, and had not even access mainly to the tools and the materials, and not even to the spaces where to create or perform. So we have many phenomena of self-building instruments, even electronic guitars, for instance, synthesizers as well, and a concept of garage music, which is not really garage as a genre, but is rather a garage music because it was recorded in garage or in homes, especially after the 80s when there was more access to the tape recording. One of these examples is this figure on the upper right corner, which are basically records made out of X-ray plates. So every year the hospitals had to get rid of them, and non-official musicians were using them to record their own songs, or sometimes also to copy from the black market music from abroad. Like one of these on the down right is Elvis Presley, for instance. Another important feature, of course, is where this was created and performed, which is the domestic environment. And most of these were called kvartirnike, which basically means flats. And one example is exactly these pictures. Down that I show you is a very famous group, post-punk group called Grajdanskaya Borona, and they're just playing, as you can see, in a living room. This implies two things. So on one hand, all these phenomena were really diffused in a way, but they were also very spontaneous and isolated one from each other. So very often it happened that certain projects were happening not being aware that 2 blocks away something very similar was going on. And on the other hand, because of this dimension and also because of the accessibility of tools, we have very scarce documentation. So there have been attempts to reconstruct all of these through interviews or from certain, maybe there are a few films, there are a few photos, but everything is really unknown in a certain way. All of this, furthermore, is working through personal connection and networking diffusion, even in a few moments where later, a bit in the 50s, well, 60s, and then in the 80s, there is somehow the possibility to perform and to produce in places, in areas which are more open, but mainly through, on one hand, a social pressure from the 80s, which is grassroots, and on the other hand, thanks to personal contacts. So one of the most important examples is this Alex Yiu, who was and still is an international renowned pianist who was teaching until the mid of the 70s in the Moscow Conservatory. So just because of this key position, he was able to use the conservatory in the closing hours to make concerts of Cage, Schnittke, and so on. This means also that the few, in the whole unofficial culture, the few groups who were a bit more active, whether in arts, in performance, and so on, they were aggregating during these moments, and these moments became a kind of a catalyzing engine, which promoted definitely what I will call a cross-pollination of different disciplines. This means that we have scientists who get interested in the esoteric writings that were smuggled inside Russia, which were actually very diffused, with conceptualist artists who are basing the work inspired by the listening of John Cage, architects who start to make sounding works and performances bound to shamanism and so on. And this is just because the scarcity of accessibility pushed these isolated groups to meet few times on very few possible occasions and exchange as much as possible. One of these examples is Central Russian upland, which is called in Russian Srednyorusskaya Vazvishenost, which is actually, it became, especially in the late years, very famous, but is actually not even a music group. They don't even know how to play. This is a group of conceptualists, a mix of conceptualist artists and a later group called Mukhamori, who, after several years, in '87, they made a tape called Golden Disc with a very ironic attempt, of course. And what they did was described by themselves as well as simulated rock. They became absolutely famous, and the reason for which they started to do this is exactly for these cross-contaminations that I was referring to before, but also because as a reaction against stereotypes that they were involved as Soviet citizens in relationship with Western world, but also once they were in the Western scene as Soviet or post-Soviet people. Here in the quote is speaking Sven Gundelach, which is one of the founder, and who is saying exactly that this group is made has been after that he realized that a gallery owner in Cologne sold his work not because of the work itself, but because of the story that was behind it, because it was presented as a Russian artist imprisoned for anti-Soviet actions and who is crazy. So. What this group represents is actually just a performative action, which is highly ironic, and whose means was basically that of deconstruct the codes, on one hand, of the Russian stereotypes seen from the West, but also using folklore and propaganda topics like the cosmos and Yuri Gagarin and so on, and on the other hand, using and exacerbating the stereotypes that were in regards to the West. And these these few performances, they were absolutely participative, so they were really endangered with this Bethanien energy of creating a kind of carnival. So artists were just taking another instrument that they were anyway not able to play. In the meantime, they were doing performances. They were involved in the public, and this is probably the most predominant feature that made them so famous, and still nowadays they are called to play. And another example is German Vinogradov, who is on the other hand coming from architecture, and who he founded together with other 3 artists the very first art squat in Moscow, which was called Детский сад, so kindergarten. And it happened just because they were working as watchmen of this kindergarten, which had to be refurbished, so they immediately squatted it, creating a 2-story building in the center, which was aiming not at creating a movement, but again to just create an open system, which was aiming to create as many languages as possible. So the need to experiment, no matter in which direction, is absolutely fundamental for them, and also to find a safe space for this, which is not necessarily the living rooms of a friend, or maybe a studio of an artist, which is kindly providing the space. And actually, this place remained open just for 4 years before KGB closed it. But it became incredibly successful, and most of the masters of art and even fashion and music, a lot of music, who passed there and who are famous now, they refer to this place as a turning point for their development. One of the founders, Vinogradov, he started in this place to create kinetic objects with the objects found, for instance, water pipes from the place, and he created Bikapo, which is basically a system of sound sculptures, which are shown and are played in a performative way until this took the shape of a huge system of installation, which now are after that KGB kicked them out, is in his own house, which is shown in not only in a performative way, but even in a ritualistic way. He started to use the principle of environmental art in a domestic context because of the espionage. But is including inside the house elements which become the source of the sound as well. So we have fire inside the house, water, air, ice, and as we can see in the image here under, there are also mirrors. It's pretty evident also that it is made out of found objects. He has been labeled even as the founder of the mystery art because, as I said, he's using in these performances elements even from shamanism, from diplophonic singing, which is very typical also of the area where shamanism was born, and even mystery of Greco-Roman mysteries. But on the other hand, we have also images and like actions and rituals which are coming from the Soviet rituality that I mentioned before, the contemporary one nowadays, and the industrial element, because most of his installations are made out of cut-out metal, and it's actually industrial music what he's doing together with this ritualistic singer. He is still active, so since '84 he's doing these performances at his place, and everything is absolutely open. Everyone is welcome every week to come, and including different artists who are doing even electronic music. Is really like a bit like in African religion, where everything is included and included and included in this big rituality. What the artist is saying, that why he's doing this still nowadays, that it mainly is therapeutic. So again, when I was mentioning at the beginning this role, this importance of both rituality within culture and the play of it, Vinogradov is in a certain way embodying his own way of creating his own rituality to compensate the void created by these ruptures. And the third example is coming from a totally different background. He is coming from physics. Already when he was a student in '76, he was working also aside as in the field of radio and radio buildings. He was also building electronic guitars to sell in the black market, for instance, and the first synthesizers and even software development. This was done mainly in his own house, as everyone. But he is one of the most active also in the attempt to create a bridge also with institutions in a way. So the way he managed to play his performances is also that of using elements of the past that could create a continuity with his own practice, which is, for instance, the works of Vladimir Khlebnikov and so on. So concerts for theater pieces which were made by avant-garde authors or acousmatic composers, which were in a way accepted by the given government. Parallelly to this, he researched a lot, not only for his own sound experimentations, but also for the history of it, and he created a collection based mainly on the objects of theremin. And what happened is that all these attempts to be inside the institutions erupted as soon as the USSR collapsed in the foundation of the Theremin Center for Electroacoustic Music, which is non-profit, and which attempts to put musicians together with computer scientists. This is one of the most fruitful attempts, because even though in 2012 they had to close it, but they are still actually going on in other places, not anymore in the Moscow Conservatory that he managed to have for a certain amount of time. He managed to create, to transmit his knowledge and his experiments tools to a newer generation of artists, which is nowadays called SA, and which is, let's say, a broad group of artists dealing with sound, media, and experimental forms, which are exposed, even participated nowadays in CTM. So, to wrap it up, sorry for maybe I've spoken a bit too long, but yeah, let's say that I've chosen 3 examples which are really not what is more obvious in the idea of non-official music. But I think that they are, in a way, more interesting because it's not very easy for people who do not know so much about this culture to know about them. And also because this liminality, which is shown, is also not only in how the lack of accessibility sometimes and the restriction of sometimes possibilities are inducing also in creating an intermingling between different words and different media. But what for me is also very interesting is the fact that on one hand, when we think about the development of culture, no matter whether it's in Soviet times or post-digital art, the movement and the dynamics of culture, of ritual, so on one hand we saw Vinogradov and so on, or play, which is the deconstruction until the performative, purely carnivalesque example of Srednjorusskaya Vozvišenost, are both very, very important. And as coming back to what Agamben said, that society must take care that the exchange of these signifiers, unstable signifiers, as I said before, of these ghosts that are menacing somehow our culture once we are in a situation of instability, which is also very fruitful, is that of trying to transmit. And in a way, I think that the last example is also showing one of the examples of how the dissolution of USSR permitted also a sort of continuity with what was before during the 20s and 30s with avant-garde, to create something which is totally new and young and also much more free. So to reinterpret in a way a culture in order to go forward. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Thank you so much, Giada Bontà, talking to us about the non-official music in 1990s post-Soviet times. So, who has questions to Giada? There's a hand in the back.
I wanted to clear the message once more because I didn't really get it fully. Is your argument is that like the liminality of the Soviet times continued into the post-Soviet times, like artists still were like doing things in liminal spaces even though you had different spaces available? Mm-hmm. And the second question, if you could name some examples, if you know them, which are not like central, you know, Moscow and everything, but maybe from regions of Russia or from like republics of the former USSR, it's also interesting, which are similar to the ones you named, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, for sure there is, as I said at the beginning, but maybe I did have not so much time to explain it better. This sense of liminality, the type of liminality that I was focusing on is the moment in which it is clear. It is clear that a system which is in a certain way empty is still repeating, but on the other hand, the future is still yet to come, is still not understanding where it is leading to. For sure, there are many specialists who are thinking, and they're saying that already in the Soviet period, there was this sense of liminality. So on one hand, something is going on forever, certain rituals are going on forever, but they could change from one day to the other. I partially agree with that. But on the other hand, I think that this really exacerbated in the late 80s. And what happened in the late 80s is something which we can see already in 93, for instance, or in 95. I said that I didn't wanted to speak about more obvious events, like, for instance, already in 1988, we have the first rave culture, for instance, in St. Petersburg, which is also very important, and so on. But I think that it is very interesting to see how this moment of liminality, which is even theorized to be lasting until now in the post-Soviet world. I partially agree with that, But I also think that there are so many layers of interactions also with, I mean, the last example was exactly an attempt to contradict this. I don't believe that until the 30s, until now, many events happened and we are still in liminal space. But I think that is mainly a feeling and a cultural tension that is perceived around a certain historical event rather than the event itself, if I've been clear enough. And for your second question, well, I focus mainly on Moscow because it was for sure the epicenter of this in terms of politics, which are still going on in a certain sense there, which is very, of course, centralized, but also because there is more documentation. If we think about other regions, for instance, for what I know, Kazakhstan had a huge production of unofficial music, which is mixing much more folkloric music with even electronic pieces. And this is, I would say, there is really a lot to research about.
Thanks. More questions? You could also marinate them or mull them over and then take them into the round table. Yeah. I mean, a question I was thinking is, but you already started answering it, was about the continuities within the many ruptures that you described, because often we look at post-socialist countries and only think of the ruptures, but when we look closer, we actually see the many continuities that you already discussed, from the early experimental music or early 20th century experimental scenes, harking back to shamanic practices, and these singer-songwriter practices are also things that have been established for a longer time, and that kind of... so more questions to this contribution here. Can you tell us a little bit about your methods, because you seem quite intimate with your research participants?
My method?
Yeah. How did you go about your research to come up with such fascinating results?
Well, on one hand, I don't come from a background which is mainly in sound studies. Quite the contrary, I come mainly from semiotic and art, so contemporary or non-official art in the Russian-speaking world. And through them, I started to get closer and closer to this moment of mixture between what is, for instance, poetry and a performative reading, where sound becomes very important. And then you realize that is absolutely fundamental also for the apophatic religion of all these countries.
But you did this through archival research or through oral history, or how did you approach the actors?
In that sense, you mean? Well, is a mix of both. So for sure there is archive work, but certain things are really not documented. Mm-hmm. So in this case, you just meet the people and for instance, I don't know, with Vinogradov, you just meet with them, you go to the performance, you speak with them, and you start to really understand how their practice is, in a way. The same thing with Smirnov, which is much easier because he's a very active person. He's teaching at both at the conservatory, and he's doing many workshops also in Berlin. So it's really a mixture between studying, archive work, and also personal...
so kind of mixture of participant observation and oral history, maybe, if you will. And do people open up their own archives to you? Do they show that their photo albums or their music collections or collections of recordings?
Yeah. I mean, each of them have their own style, and I would say that especially the very specific condition that, as I said, oblige them to make a DIY, to have a DIY path, has also created like their own very peculiar collection. So Smirnov is much more a scientist, and everything is very dated. He is the biggest collector of Theremin objects. So once you go there, you can touch with your
very systematic collection, if you will. Yes.
Yeah. On the other hand, the other groups have basically artist archive. So you have small objects, the pieces of cake which was splashed in the face of a person attending to the show. So it's very varied and different.
Than an archive, maybe,
Yeah.
but personal collections. Wonderful. Yeah. Any more questions to this contribution? Can I see a hand up? Well, if you have more questions, you can ask them at the round table. And let's thank Giada Dalla Bontà for her contribution here. Would you like to set up while I'm... Okay, time is moving on as we're listening to fascinating information. Matilda, do you need time to set up, or are you ready to go?
I think, yep, I'm ready.
Yeah? So while we're setting up, I'll introduce Matilda Jones to you. We would need her projection to go. Oh yeah, it's going on the back screen, thank you. She works at Freie Universität, and she is, as the other two speakers, she's also an artist and a researcher. You should check out her work under the moniker of Teplice. I listened to it this morning on Bandcamp. It's very pleasant, and yeah, she wears many hats. She's a producer, singer, songwriter. She's a researcher, but she's also a radio person, a radio researcher, radio producer. And today she will talk about a subject that's very dear to my heart: collective joy in public spaces. So the importance of a pleasure for the social. Give a very warm welcome to Matilda Jones.
Hello, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, okay. So I will start this this talk about happiness with an anecdote. So about a month ago, after a visit home for Christmas, I began the journey back to Berlin with my dad, and he walked me just as far as the station to see me off. My dad likes to mark occasions such as farewells with some words of reflection, and this time was no different. "We do worry about you, you know," he said, seriously. "You're doing so well," he said. "You have a job, somewhere to live, good friends, a stable relationship. We just hope that you're happy." Listening to this inventory, this tick-boxing of my achievements, I was stumped to disagree. Given the obvious fulfillment of basic social and material needs, how could I dispute? I nodded politely. However, following our goodbye, continuing my journey alone, I couldn't shake the feeling that my discontent, angst, unease given the state of the world at the dawn of 2020 was justified. Ultimately, I find it hard to believe that a person's tendency toward unhappiness is simply dependent on their orientation toward individual attainments. So, in this context, drawing upon Lynn Siegel's Radical Happiness, which considers the potential and politicization of happiness in contemporary society, alongside Sarah Ahmed's feminist etymological discussion, Killing Joy, I emphasize the liminality of happiness, focusing on the intersection between the personal and the historical moment to expose the politics of private emotions in the public sphere. After acknowledging the rise in anxiety and depression, I revive Barbara Ehrenreich's history of collective joy. Noting Ehrenreich's assertion of the ecstatic power of self-loss and communal congregation, this analysis builds to rephrase the question, proffered by both Segal and Ehrenreich. The question of whether a collective, joyful orientation towards a common public could help foster a meaningful utopian vision in which moments of shared happiness are posited as a vehicle for sustained social, political, economic, and ecological change. Consequently, celebrating the fleeting power of happiness, I conclude, insisting upon the need to experience, and here I quote Ehrenreich, the immediate joy of solidarity in the face of state and corporate power, in which I include the existential threat of climate change. So, defining happiness in liminal terms as an emotion always hovering somewhere between the strictly personal and potentially public, Lynn Segal locates the role and meaning of happiness against a pervasive culture of individualism. Segal's observation that public awareness easily blurs into private emotions provokes us to consider the personal dimension to our activity as citizens, whilst acknowledging a contemporary global context in which misery and fear are increasingly evident. Building upon this idea, Segal's declaration that feelings of happiness are entwined with our ties to the outside world, mostly to other people, but also to all that we are able to do or are restricted from doing, also captures a notion of interpersonal liminalities, recalling the familiar feminist maxim, the personal as political, whilst gesturing to the idea of happiness as expectation. And it's here that we come to the self-described feminist killjoy, Sarah Ahmed. So Ahmed's claim that happiness translates its wish into a politics that demands others live according to that wish, further exposes happiness as liminal, alerting us to the notion that ideas of happiness are often pressed upon us through our contact with the outside world. Pointing to the word's etymology, Ahmed makes clear that happiness was not always rendered as expectation, noting that the word happy originally meant having good hap or fortune. Ahmed goes on to explain that the hap, this momentary experience of happiness, has been eliminated through successive cultural ideas of what happiness should constitute. This is best illustrated in relation to the female experience. Ahmed's most prominent example is the trope of the wedding day, whereby young girls, even now, are told to expect the happiest day of your life. In this way, Ahmed shows how the hap, this fleeting element of chance, is eliminated as we form expectations of this encounter before it has even occurred. Consequently, the liminal relationship between private emotions and the public sphere is politicized through expectation and subsequent restriction with regard to what is allowed to be perceived as happy. This hap, the moment, is eliminated via the imperative of a constructed idea of happiness, which functions to uphold a system of patriarchal capitalism. So this framework, these tools to question what constitutes happiness, I think is particularly relevant in the context of this current wellness craze, this fad in which happiness, or the well self, is fetishized and consumed through lifestyle commodities. Eva Illouz's term, immodities, comes to mind here. So I want to draw our attention to a chapter in Illouz's book by Edgar Cabanas, who, similarly to Segal, locates the coercive character of happiness under neoliberalism. Arguing that contemporary society constructs happiness as an utterly individualistic endeavor which completely obliterates any problematization of political, economic, or social circumstances, Cabanas pinpoints society's weaponization of happiness, even going so far as to say that the discourse of personal happiness is progressively taking over the discourse of individualism in the neoliberal model of citizenship. Referencing the United Nations International Day of Happiness, founded in March 2012, Cabanis demonstrates the global breadth of this happiness imperative before exposing its alignment with an economic impetus. For example, as happiness becomes much more a matter of frequency than intensity, and low-grade but frequent positive emotions and feelings define happiness better than intense but low-frequency ones, happiness can no longer be dutifully imagined as a temporary, fleeting, or passing state. In other words, in this neoliberal configuration of happiness, Ahmed's hap is even more explicitly erased in favor of a stable, happy self, a self predisposed to consumption and productivity. This is important not least because of the link between individualism and depression, which Cabanis, Siegel, and Ehrenreich do not allow us to forget. Referencing the mushrooming crises of depression and anxiety at odds with a polished veneer of consumerist happiness which engineers self-blame and passivity, each writer characterizes our present moment with reference to this sad epidemic. So here we move to Barbara Ehrenreich, so there's a bit more happiness. Barbara Ehrenreich connects the growing prevalence of depression over the past 200 years to the prohibition of spontaneous public carnivals in 17th century Europe, which occurred contemporaneously with the suppression of collective rituals across the world under European colonialism. Emphasizing the increasing significance of the self in Western modernity, Ehrenreich notes that a key facet of collective joy is self-loss, an experience of human communion which releases one from the prison of the self, an experience hence pointing out that the same social forces that disposed Europeans to depression also swept away a traditional cure in the name of modernity and progress. Despite recognizing present-day forms of congregation, such as the ones mentioned earlier here today, and music festivals, sporting events, and rave culture, ultimately Ehrenreich privileges bygone forms of collective ritual as free, shared, non-hierarchical, and often spontaneous events. So, defining collective joy as a sharper, more intense form of pleasure than anything defined by the word community, Ehrenreich mourns the disappearance of collective ecstasy as an unfathomable loss for human heritage. So, ultimately, whether the question of human heritage should be given more or less thought given our increasing existential awareness of climate breakdown, shifting the imperative away from a vapid consumerist happiness towards a joyful collective action should surely be a goal to which we all aspire. As Ahmed, Siegel, and Ehrenreich all assert the invaluability of consciousness raising, albeit recognizing the fallibility of political movements past and present, yet it's worth noting that Ehrenreich accepts that no amount of hand-holding or choral dancing will bring about world peace. Overall, it is the fleeting moment, the hap that emerges, the immediate joy of solidarity, a moment of shared radical optimism, which is our sole source of strength. Thank you.
Am I on? Yes. Thank you, Matilda Jones, for this very focused and theoretical input on happiness. And I'm particularly, I'm still mulling over the hap, the serendipitous nature, because I have this whole kind of association of haphazard, hapless, happen, anything to do with hap and serendipity. So I think that's a beautiful moment in your theoretical considerations here. So any comments, questions? maybe also questions about how we can link this to listening to uncertainty, and also maybe joys and potentialities of music and dancing, as you were referring to at the other talks. Do you want to use the moment to elaborate a little bit on that?
Well, we could first see if anyone has any questions.
Yeah, does anyone have any questions at this point? Okay, maybe you can elaborate a little bit, expand a little bit on how you're thinking those connections in light of what you presented, and then maybe some more questions will materialize.
Yeah, I think this idea of, I mean, because we've been talking about earlier today about music festivals and club culture, and I think this idea of the self participating in these spaces becomes very important, because what Ehrenreich is discussing is kind of mourning the loss of kind of old ritual and carnival, as they are spontaneous and inherently non-hierarchical. And today, so as Ehrenreich kind of discusses the constitution of the self and how the word self didn't even really appear in our language, it only really was used in a reflexive way. This like coincided with kind of middle-class homes beginning to own mirrors, and this whole idea of the self is born. And so, as I think this is kind of inextricably related to our current culture, because as we kind of participate in music events and kind of festivals and things today, we are, I mean, to what extent can we truly experience self-loss? To what extent is our participation in these spaces egotistical? And that's not to say that that makes it a bad thing, but where is the kind of can we truly experience collective joy in this kind of non-hierarchical sense as soon as it becomes not spontaneous, and as soon as it's kind of this kind of ritual of going out to club cultures nowadays, it seems so kind of bound up with the individual, and you know, as all this kind of preparation, it's a very kind of individualistic act that revolves around the self. I don't know, maybe this is something that we can discuss, because I'm not really, I'm willing to be persuaded the other way, but I think given the kind of the amount of individualism in our culture, how it is so completely kind of woven into every aspect of our lives, to what extent are we really able to kind of forget ourselves, unless, of course, that is in a kind of a social or political movement where the organization it's built around something bigger, and it's kind of, it has a clear purpose, and it's sort of more utopian in its kind of action, and its
I mean, it's also reminding me what you're saying of this, as you were discussing the rise of anxiety and depression, also this kind of concomitant rise of having information on your fingertips, but a growing need for security at the same time. So this is, again, I mean, this would feed into your argument that chance is erased and serendipity is erased by over-documentation, over-planning through being connected through the digital world. But I'm wondering if there is, how do you see a way out of this theoretical dilemma that you're posing here? Where's the potentiality?
Yeah, I mean, I think
in a theoretical and maybe also in a concrete way.
I mean, I think this, I suppose, because I think there's, so for example, you have like CBT that's like a common treatment for depression nowadays, and it's like, how much is this when people are using like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, has been criticized by people because it's not dealing with the root causes. It's kind of training your brain to slide over those the kind of causes of your sadness or
rather
anxiety.
than addressing the systematic shortages, it's training people to become better or more adept neoliberal subjects, if you will. But then, are you applying the theoretical observations you presented here also to examples in your research, or are you planning to do that?
Well, at the moment I'm writing a thesis on so I'm applying it kind of in a national context. So I'm looking at the 2012 London Olympic Games opening ceremony. So I'm applying it in that context to kind of these ideas of collective joy on a national
Mass
level.
euphoria connected
to but also kind of Sarah Ahmed is also very useful in this context because she talks about the idea of love within the nation and who is excluded from that and who is allowed to participate. So obviously affect is it plays a role here. But to be honest, with the interest in happiness and collective joy, I think, Ehrenreich is very interesting to me because, because I think she's basically, she's a kind of anthropologist and a post-colonial theorist, and she's kind of tying together all of these different strands, and this idea of like mourning something that in a kind of existential kind of concern about like the kind of future of humanity. So it's not, for me, it's not really the fact that it links to happiness and it can link to kind of a personal practice of how we approach life that I kind of take solace in just for myself.
Okay.
Yeah, why not?
Okay. So the theoretical work is a gratification unto itself rather than needing to be applied to anything. Okay, any more questions about collective joy? And I think this is, it's oh, wonderful, yeah.
Yes. Would you like to compare your the political joy into the politicization of depression in the Mark Fisher's term? Would you see a dialectical relationship in between, Mark Fisher's depression, the notion of depression, where like is politicizing the society, or the reason why people having depression is a political reason. So as in a dialectical relation to the joyness, where you're talking about, where is a joy where being politicized through the social economical structure.
Well, I mean, the growth of depression is something that it kind of, in terms of Ehrenreich's argument, this appears alongside the development of the self in kind of Western modernity. So, yeah, I'm not sure that answers your question, but...
Because the symptoms were it is also the origin or the formations of depression is also because of let's say the new capitalism, where it subconsciously influence our brain, where the advertisement and things that we watch, we receive from our phone every day, has a notion of to achieve happiness through a certain ways. If you are not doing that, and then you realize there's no such thing called happiness if you're not doing that, and then so you are being people are being suggested to fit into this idea that I have to meditate to become to gain fulfillment of life, but which I found it absurd in a sense.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, the reason that I used this phrase radical optimism at the end is because I was alluding to Lauren Berlant, who talks about cruel optimism as a kind of condition that we are fed in society, where we are taught to aspire to things that are kind of inherently unattainable. So, yeah, I think that kind of speaks to what you were saying in the sense of what what are we taught to aspire, and also back to Ahmed's idea of expectation, what are we taught to aspire to, what is supposed to be expected as happy. And I suppose what I wanted to do was kind of complicate that a bit and bring it back to this idea of, well, we can just experience happiness in the moment. And of course that links to so much as what people have been discussing today with regard to like the kind of social movements and dance culture and music.
Thank you so much, Matilda. It's really been a pleasure to listen to you unpacking the contradictories of joy and optimism, because I think really there's a lot to think about in terms of, also how to create certain forms of joy through collectiveness, as you were suggesting here, and how to not fall for the lure of particular forms of happiness that are peddled and that we're supposed to aspire to. So thank you all for your attention, for coming out to listen to our second module today here at Research Networking Day, CTM's Research Networking Day. The name of this module is The Sound of Change, Listening to Instability, and our speakers were Alex Yiu from Hong Kong, Giada Bontà, who now lives in Berlin, and Matilda Jones, who's also a Berliner. So please give our speakers a warm round of applause, and